like a lot of writers I know, I have a million quotes all over the bulletin board in my office, and I stare up at them constantly, searching for inspiration. But the one that I always come back to is Oprah. Now, I went to Columbia University and I studied the great books, so I wish I could tell you that it was Socrates or Plato, but it's Oprah. And it goes like this: we don't become what we want, we become what we believe. It's not even from a book or a magazine article. She just said it one day on the talk show, and I scribbled it down, and I've never been able to let it go. It's always stayed with me, especially that last part: we become what we believe. It's like a warning, like a flashing yellow light, reminding us all to slow down and choose our stories wisely. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a TV writer and I make a good living telling stories. I really genuinely believe stories are that important, that they can have this strangely predictive power over our lives. There's the stories that we all personally make up about ourselves. I'm the smart one in the family. I'm good with people. And then there's the stories we just see and hear over and over again, the ones we're drawn to. These are the stories that have the power to control our destiny. For example, there's the one about the diamond ring and the walk down the aisle and the happily ever after. You've probably heard that one before. It's fairly popular and newly legal for everyone in some 37 states. It's a story that's complete in 3 acts. Act 1, meet someone. Act 2, fall in love. Act 3, get married. It's very simple, it's very structurally sound, but when I was growing up, there was a huge part of it I didn't understand. It just didn't ring true in some essential way. So I made up a different story for myself. I dreamt that one day, God willing, fingers crossed, I would grow up to be a spinster. Now, if you've ever read a book written before 1900, or even one written before 1990, you probably know that being a spinster wasn't always the glamorous and exciting undertaking that it is today. Today, it actually involves a lot of casual sex, pink cocktails, and expensive shoes. But in previous generations, it actually had a lot of stigma and shame attached to it. The hours were long, the outfits were not particularly cute, and brunch was not included. That's when I signed up for it. Back in the day when being a spinster was an easy shorthand way of announcing to the world, I'm gonna do something interesting with my life. Jane Austen, Florence Nightingale, Gloria Steinem, fictional TV news producers like Mary Richards. These were extraordinary, inspirational women, women who rejected the conventional narrative of their time. They didn't blend in, they stood out. But then, right around the turn of the millennium, the golden age of being a spinster ended. And in what seemed like the blink of an eye, the human condition of being female, over 30, and still single became completely and totally normal. In fact, it became quite boring. I blame the media. First, there was Ally McBeal, who did something the Bronte sisters never could quite nail. She made spinsterhood look easy, like it was all hot cocoa and fluffy pajamas. Soon, every sorority sister in America was sitting in front of her TV screaming, "That's me! I'm just like her!" Next came everyone's favorite British singleton, Bridget Jones, who at least had the decency not to be so ridiculously skinny. And then finally, that super popular cable TV show with the pink cocktails and the expensive shoes. I could mention the name, but do they really need more publicity? And besides, they had their chance to hire me, and they passed. That's right, as I mentioned, I'm a TV writer. I've been doing it for a while now, so my resume is pretty substantial, which means that if you are sitting next to me on a plane, there's a very good chance that you've seen one of the shows I've written for. Masters of Sex, Parenthood, Californication, Gilmore Girls, and I like to joke that I worked on Dawson's Creek for longer than I was actually in high school. But in the fall of 1998, I had no experience. I was just getting started. I had written a freelance episode. I'd been a staff writer on a sitcom no one saw. But somehow, some way, I managed to land the one job interview that every female writer in LA wanted, and I blew it. I didn't get the job. Now, this rejection stung, of course. All rejection does. But the unique thing about this rejection was that it continued to sting every Sunday night at 9 for the next 5 or 6 years. You know, until the show finally went off the air, and I'm over it now. I think we can all tell. But when I look back, I can see so clearly there's no way they could have hired me for that show. I wouldn't have hired me for that show. You see, the basic building block of that show was dating stories, stories about falling in love. And as a spinster, I didn't have any of those stories, not a single one. Now, most people want to fall in love, so they fall. I know we'd all prefer to think of love as some kind of magical, mystical force that descends from on high. We want it to be like poetry. But the more prosaic truth of the post-Bachelor era is that most people put love on their list of things to do in life. They devote enormous amounts of time and energy to finding it and keeping it. But as a spinster, I never did that. I never put love on my list of things to do in life. It simply never occurred to me that my life would conform to that story. Act 1, meet someone. Act 2, fall in love. Act 3, get married. Now, don't get me wrong, I got the memo about how amazing and swoon-inducing love was going to be. I consumed all the usual entertainments on that subject. You know, all those stories about how one day, if you were super lucky and you looked a certain way and you kept up with all the routine beauty maintenance procedures described in the various women's magazines, well, it would happen for you. Your prince would come. When I was growing up, I read all those stories, I saw all those movies, but I guess my problem was I never actually believed them. Or at least I never believed that they applied to me in any way, shape, or form. You see, well before I figured out how to turn this into a career, I always had this strange tendency to take stories apart and analyze how they were put together. And at a certain point that must have been around junior high, it occurred to me that all stories about falling in love had exactly the same catalyst, the girl's prettiness. Now, there was some wiggle room here. The pretty girl in a falling in love story could be a blonde with a hot body, or she could be a brunette with a hot body. But on TV and in the movies, and even in most books, the pretty part was not negotiable. Oh, sure, people would spout these platitudes. They would say, love is blind, looks don't matter, there's someone out there for everyone. But hard as I tried, I could never reconcile that with the reality of the world around me, or with any of the stories out there. Indeed, if you had time between episodes of Charlie's Angels to give the matter any serious thought, it seemed more likely that the reverse was true. Looks did matter. They mattered desperately. The female lead in a falling in love story simply had to be pretty. Otherwise, the male lead would never catch sight of her and fall in love, and the whole story would never get going. It would never advance past that Act 1 stage. Now, once I had this mind-altering revelation, I could never get past how fundamentally foolish it would be for a girl who didn't have a lot going on in the prettiness department to invest too heavily in this whole falling in love story. Didn't really seem like it was going to work out so well for her. And that was me. I know everybody says that about themselves, supermodels, movie stars. But in my case, from the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I was chubby, I had a lazy eye that turned in, I wore glasses. These were all definite strikes against you in the prettiness department. And I suppose I could have done more to change all that, but instead, I chose a different story. Spinsterhood, dying alone, not going to the prom. Somehow, all of that seemed easier to me, much easier than waking up every day for the rest of my life and putting on makeup. Plus, others had done the spinster thing before me and done it well. They lived in big cities. They had interesting jobs in the arts. In Chicago in the early 80s, there was actually this very nice spinster lady on TV every morning. Her show was called AM Chicago. She struggled with her weight, she was devoted to her career. Clearly she hadn't made getting married the be-all and end-all of her existence, but things seemed to be going okay for her. They still do. And just in case I'm the only one keeping track, she's still not married. Now, when I chose the spinster story for myself, I did recognize that there would be some downsides. Loneliness was a distinct possibility. Although I've since realized that if you do not spend your 20s having a series of histrionic boyfriend-girlfriend relationships that don't quite work out, your loneliness is not as intense as that of the young woman you work with who's in her early 30s, who can't stop talking for more than 2 seconds in a row about that guy who dumped her 4 years ago. Other downsides, of course, in the era before the expensive shoes and the pink cocktails, spinsters were often mocked for their lack of sex appeal and poor fashion choices. But as someone who didn't have a lot going on in the prettiness department, I was fairly used to being mocked for my personal appearance. It didn't seem like that aspect of my life could possibly get any worse once I got myself out of junior high. No, in every way that mattered at the time, the prospect of growing up to be a spinster actually held a lot of hope and promise. It didn't seem like a tragic story or a pitiful one. It seemed like the key to a better life. And in certain ways it has been. In my 20s, I never fell in love or walked down the aisle. I had jobs, read books, watched a lot of TV. In my 30s, I stopped having jobs and began to have what's more commonly known as a career in TV. And this career's had its ups and downs, one of the downs being the part where I was passed over for the job on the super popular cable TV show. But overall, it's been a source of great fulfillment and joy to me. Probably because the only other dream I had for myself when I was growing up, besides the dream of being a spinster, was the dream of being a writer. I put that on my list of things to do in life. I devoted enormous amounts of time and energy to making it happen, and it happened. And even though the Hollywood writer in me knows that my story would be a better story if it had a conventional Act 3 happy ending, that's not how this story ends. Because we don't become what we want. We become what we believe. Thank you.